The lamp is lit, the room is warm, and there is nowhere you need to be for the next little while, so let your shoulders drop and your breathing slow. And let the day you have just finished slide off you the way a heavy coat slides off at the door. Because tonight we are going to walk, very gently and without any hurry at all, through the whole long life of a man who lived and died more than 1600 years ago, and yet who left behind, quite by accident, a small book that has been comforting tired people in the dark ever since. Not a painter this time, not a builder of bridges or a maker of pictures, but a Roman emperor, which is to say a man who once held more of the world in his two ordinary hands than almost anyone who has ever lived, and who, strange to say, did not want it, and would have given it all, gladly, for a quiet room and a shelf of books and a lamp not so very different from the one that is keeping you company now. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and the world keeps only two pictures of him, really, after all this time. The first is a statue, a great bronze horseman up on a hill in the middle of Rome, a calm bearded man on a calm walking horse, his hand held out not in command, but in something more like a blessing, as though he were quieting a crowd rather than conquering it. And that hand has stayed lifted, gently, through 1600 winters. And the second picture is smaller and quieter still, and it is the one we will keep coming back to tonight, and it is only this. A tired man, late at night, in a cold tent at the edge of the known world, bent over a little private notebook by the light of a single small flame, writing down not orders, not laws, not the history of his wars, but soft reminders to his own weary heart, reminders to be patient and to be kind, and not to be afraid, words he wrote for no one at all, meant to be read by no eyes but his own, and then to be thrown away or forgotten with him when he died. But they were not thrown away, and they were not forgotten, and that little book, which we now call the Meditations, though he never gave it any name, floated down all the long centuries and washed up, tonight, here in your quiet room, and that is the story we are going to walk through, from his very first breath to his very last, slowly and softly, and all the way to the end. So you do not need to hold on to any of it. You do not need to remember a single name or a single date. You can close your eyes now if you like, and let the words simply move over you like a warm current, because I will keep the thread of it for you, and he will still be here, this gentle emperor and his little lamp, whether you are awake to hear the end or have long since drifted off into sleep, and either way is entirely all right, because there truly is no hurry at all. And so let us begin where all of us begin, at the beginning with a baby, on an ordinary spring morning, a very long time ago. Picture, if you will, the city of Rome in the year 121, which is nearly 1900 years before your own bedside lamp was ever made, and yet it was a good time to be alive there, perhaps as good a time as that old world ever knew, because the empire had stopped growing and had settled into a long, warm, easy noon of itself, its borders quiet, its roads safe, its cities full of fountains and marble and the smell of bread and dust and olive oil, and over it all a broad blue Mediterranean sky, the very same sky, you might gently remind yourself, the same sun and the same slow-turning stars that lie over your own roof tonight. And into that unworried city, on the 26th of April in that year, a boy was born into a family that had everything a family could reasonably want. A comfortable, honourable, well-settled Roman family of the senator class, people of old Spanish stock who had done well for generations, who had land and money and a fine house on one of the city's green hills, and good name and good manners. And the boy was given, as Roman boys were, a long ceremonial string of names, and was called, in the beginning, Marcus Annius Verus, after his father and his grandfather before him. And it is worth resting for a moment on that little word at the end, verus, because in Latin it simply means true, or truthful, and it ran in the family like the colour of their hair, and it would come, before very long, to fit this particular boy so exactly that an old dying emperor would one day make a small gentle joke of it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and there is no need to hurry. So let us stay here a little while in the nursery, in the warm early years while the boy is small. Because the first great sorrow of his life came early, so early that he could barely have known it as a sorrow at all, when his father, that first Marcus Annius Verus, died while the boy was still very young, only 2 or 3 years old, a healthy man of no great age simply gone. The way people went in those days, quietly and without much warning, and the little boy was left without the tall figure he should have grown up beside. And here is a tender thing, one of the first tender things we know about him, and it is this. When Marcus was an old man, an emperor, worn down by decades of the heaviest cares a person can carry, and he sat down by his lamp to write those private notes to himself, almost the very first thing he wrote, the very first person he thanked, was that father he could hardly remember, and what he thanked him for was an example of what he called quiet manliness, or modesty and a manly character, a way of being strong that did not need to raise its voice. And it is a strange and touching thing to think that a man could carry, all his long life, the shape of a father he lost as a toddler, and could love him for a lesson he must have half invented out of family stories and a fading image, and yet that lesson, gentleness that did not have to shout, ran through the whole of Marcus's life like a thread of gold. So perhaps he understood his father better than any of us will ever know. And with the father gone, the raising of the boy fell to the other steady hands of the household. And there were good hands there, and this matters, because a person is very largely made in the first rooms they live in, and the rooms Marcus lived in were decent ones. There was his grandfather, the older Marcus Annius Verus, a distinguished old senator who had been consul 3 times, a great honour, and who took the fatherless boy into his own home and raised him there. And there was, above all, his mother, a woman named Domitia Lucilla, who came from money from a family that owned brickworks and tileworks. The very bricks and tiles that built the roofs of Rome, and yet who lived, we are told, without any of the softness and show that such money might have bought her, simply and plainly and without extravagance. And Marcus loved her, and remembered her too in that little book, and thanked her, gently, for teaching him reverence and simple living, and to stay far away from the habits of rich and wasteful people, and to be generous with his hands and slow with his wants. And you can begin to see, can't you, even now, the kind of grown man that such a childhood was quietly preparing, a man raised among wealth to distrust wealth, raised in the greatest city on earth to prefer a plain life. A boy taught before he could argue that the things everyone chases are mostly not worth the chasing. And he was, by every account we have, a serious child and an unusually honest one. Honest to the point where grown-ups noticed it and remarked on it and were charmed by it, because he did not seem to be able to lie, or to flatter, or to hide what he thought behind the pretty half-truths that people learn so early. And this frank truthfulness of his became almost famous in the small bright world of the Roman aristocracy, and it climbed in time all the way up to the very top, to the notice of the emperor himself. Because the emperor in those days was a restless, brilliant, difficult man named Hadrian, the one who built the Great Wall across the north of Britain and travelled tirelessly to every corner of his empire, a man of sharp eyes and sudden moods. And Hadrian, it happened, knew the boy's family and took an interest in this grave, honest child, and watched him growing up, and he made, out of that little family word Verus, a gentle nickname for the boy, calling him not merely true, but the truest, Verissimus, the most truthful one. And it stuck, and there is something lovely and a little bit sad in it too, that the great powerful emperor, surrounded all his life by people who told him only what he wished to hear, should look at one small honest boy and find him so refreshing that he had to give him a name for it. And so the boy grew, in that upright, frugal, well-loved household, into a thoughtful, dutiful young man. And somewhere in his teenage years the thing happened that would shape the whole inner shape of the rest of his life. The thing that, more than any throne or any war, was the true centre of him. He fell in love with philosophy. Not philosophy the way we sometimes think of it, dry and clever and full of arguments, but philosophy the old way, the Greek way, as a whole manner of living, a discipline of the soul, a daily practice of trying to become a better and calmer and freer person. And the boy took to it not as a subject to be studied, but as a life to be lived. And he took to it hard. The way the young take to the things they love, with his whole heart and no half measures. He put on the rough plain cloak that the Greek philosophers wore, a coarse thing, nothing like the fine soft clothes a boy of his station would ordinarily have, and he wore it about the house, and he took up the hard, simple habits of the philosophers too. And there is one small story from these years that is too gentle to leave out, and it is this, that the young Marcus, in the first fervour of it all, decided that a true philosopher should not sleep soft, and so he gave up his comfortable bed and lay down to sleep instead on the bare hard ground, or on a plain board with only a skin thrown over it, as the old teachers did. Wanting to toughen himself, wanting to want nothing, and he did this until his mother, gentle Domitia Lucilla, worried for her serious boy sleeping on the cold floor of a marble house, coaxed him, softly the way mothers do, back onto a proper bed at last, and you can picture the whole small scene, the earnest, thin young man determined to need nothing, and the loving mother who could not bear to see him uncomfortable, and love winning as it should, and the boy sleeping in a bed again, a little embarrassed perhaps, but warmer. And whether that story happened in exactly that way or grew a little softer and rounder in the retelling over all these years, it is far too fitting to leave out, because it tells you, in one picture, the whole of the tension that would run through his entire life, this deep, honest, almost stubborn longing to live simply, to master himself, to want the quiet inner life of the mind and nothing more, colliding, always, gently but immovably, with the world's insistence that he was needed for something larger, that he could not be allowed to disappear into his books and his cloak and his hard, clean discipline, because other, more powerful people had other plans for him. For here is the great and quiet irony at the heart of everything we are going to tell tonight, and it is worth holding gently in your mind as you drift, because it is the truest thing about him. This was a young man who wanted, more than anything, to be left alone with his philosophy, to live a small, good, private life of study and self-improvement, and he was, at that very moment, being deliberately and carefully steered, by the most powerful hands in the world, straight toward the throne of the entire Roman Empire, toward the very last thing his gentle heart desired, toward a mountain of duty so vast it would take everything he had and give him almost no rest for the rest of his days. And he did not choose it. That is the thing to remember. He did not want it, and he did not reach for it, and it was laid upon him. Because the Emperor Hadrian, growing old now, and sick, and increasingly alone, had a problem that had no easy answer, which was that he had no son, no child of his own to follow him, and the whole vast machine of the empire, all its legions and provinces and roads and grain ships, and millions upon millions of lives, would one day need a hand to hold it. And Hadrian, lying ill and thinking about the future of a world he would not live to see, set himself to arrange the succession, to choose, from among the men he knew, who should come after him, and after that, who should come after that, reaching out with his mind past his own death, and past the death of his heir, to try to secure a good long stretch of steady rule. And his eye, of course, fell on the honest boy he had nicknamed the Truest. But Marcus was still too young to be made an emperor's direct heir, and so Hadrian arranged something cleverer and gentler, a kind of adoption within an adoption, a bridge across a generation. He chose to be his own immediate successor, a mild, wealthy, deeply decent senator named Antoninus, a man already past 50, honest and calm and unambitious, a man everyone trusted, and Hadrian adopted this Antoninus as his son and heir on one single condition, that Antoninus in turn adopt young Marcus, and raise him, and make him his own heir, so that the throne would pass in time from the dying Hadrian to the steady Antoninus, and then at last to the boy in the philosopher's cloak. And so the future was quietly folded up and put in order, while Marcus was still young enough to have had no say in any of it. And so it was done, and the boy who wanted only his books found himself, almost overnight, transplanted out of his grandfather's frugal house and into the household of the next emperor, adopted, renamed, his whole future rewritten, set on a moving path he had not asked to step onto and could not now step off. And there were other pieces of the plan too, as there always are with the marriages of the powerful, threads tied off to bind families together. And one of these threads was a girl, a young woman named Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus himself, and it was arranged, in the way these things were arranged, that Marcus should be betrothed and in time married to her, so that the family bonds would be doubled and the succession made even more secure, and though it began as a matter of state and not tied for reasons of empire, Faustina would be at his side for most of the rest of his life, through more than 30 years, through the birth of many children and the loss of most of them, through wars and plagues and the endless cold camps of the north, and he would love her in his quiet way and mourn her deeply when she was gone. But all of that is still far ahead of us, still years and years away, and there is no need to reach for it yet. For now, hold only this, as your breathing slows and the lamp keeps its small, steady light beside you, a gentle, honest young man, raised in decency, in love with a quiet philosophy of self-mastery and peace, who wanted nothing so much as to be left alone with his own soul, being lifted, carefully and irresistibly, by the hands of dying emperors and the machinery of a vast old world, toward a weight he never asked to carry, and would never once, in all the long years to come, set down. And the old Emperor Hadrian died, at last, worn out and in pain, having arranged the future as well as he could, and the mild good Antoninus stepped up quietly into the great office, and the boy Marcus, now a young man, moved one step closer to the thing that was coming for him, and stood, still in the wings, still half in his beloved books, on the threshold of a reign, and a whole tide of troubles, and a small lamp in a distant tent, that were all, gently, patiently, beginning to wait for him. And so the boy who had wanted only the quiet life of study came, in the fullness of time and against every wish of his own heart, to the very throne of the world, though he came to it slowly, the way the light comes into a room in the morning, not all at once but by patient degrees, and the years before that arrival were long and mild and kind. For after Hadrian was gone, the empire passed into the steady hands of Antoninus Pius, the gentle man who had adopted Marcus and set him on the path, and under that good old ruler Marcus lived a long apprenticeship of more than 20 years, learning the whole slow craft of governing, not from books, but from the quiet daily example of a man who did his duty without fuss and without cruelty and without any hunger for glory at all. And you might picture those years as the calm part of the story, the wide still water before the river narrows and quickens, because Antoninus was frugal and patient and just, a ruler who kept the peace so gently that later men could barely find a war to record in his reign, and Marcus stood at his side through all of it, watching how a good man carries power, watching how he listens, how he waits, how he refuses to be hurried into harshness, and Marcus took all of it into himself the way a field takes in rain, quietly and completely, so that for the rest of his life, whenever he wondered how to act, he had only to ask himself how that mild old man would have acted, and the answer would come, and he would follow it. And if you are already growing drowsy, that is exactly right, because there is nothing sharp in these years to keep you awake, only a young man learning patience from an old one, and the lamp beside you burning low and steady, and the same soft stars turning overhead that turned over Rome all those centuries ago, and then, in the year 161, when Marcus was already a man of 40, grey coming into his beard and the long training behind him, the old Emperor Antoninus lay down for the last time, and the story is told, whether it happened just so, or grew a little gentler in the retelling, that near the end, when the fever had him, the tribune of the guard came to ask him for the night's watchword, the single word that would pass the sentries in the dark, and the dying man gave it, and the word he chose was equanimity, which is to say, calmness, evenness of soul, the quiet steadiness that lets a man meet whatever, comes without being knocked off his feet. And then he turned over as if going to sleep, and slept, and did not wake. And it is hard to imagine a softer death or a truer last word from such a man. And so the weight of the world came down at last upon Marcus, who had spent his whole life not wanting it. And here is the first thing he did with that weight. And it tells you almost everything about him. Because instead of clutching all that power to himself, the way nearly every man before him had done, he turned at once to his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, and insisted that they rule together, as equals, two emperors sharing the one throne, which had never truly been done before in quite that way. And he did it not because he was forced to, but because he thought it right and generous and fair. And so from the very beginning of his reign, you see the shape of the man, a man who would rather share a burden than hoard a glory. And the two brothers took up the rule of the world together, the sober, quiet Marcus and the more easy-going, pleasure-loving Lucius. And for a breath, for just a moment, all seemed calm, and then the troubles began, and they did not really stop again for the rest of his life. And I will walk you through them now, but softly, and at a great and merciful distance, the way you might hear distant thunder from a warm, dry bed, and feel only how safe and far away it is. Because none of these old storms can reach you tonight. They are 1,600 years spent and gone, and you may let them roll past you like weather while you rest. And the first of them came out of the east, where the great rival empire of Parthia, beyond the rivers, broke the peace and swept into the Roman lands there, and so an army had to be sent. And Lucius Verus went to oversee that eastern war, while Marcus stayed to hold the centre, and after several hard years the war was won, the eastern frontier steadied, the legions victorious, and the soldiers began the long march home. And this is where the story turns from the ordinary sadness of war to something larger and stranger and sadder, because the returning armies carried something home with them that no wall could stop and no sword could kill. A sickness, a great pestilence that came up out of the east with the marching men and spread along the roads and into the cities. The plague that later ages would call the Antonine Plague, after the very family that ruled while it raged. And it went through the crowded towns of the empire like a cold wind through a field of grain. And it did not come once and leave, it came and lingered and returned, year after year, emptying streets, thinning out whole cities, taking the poor and the rich, the soldier and the child, in numbers no one could truly count. And I tell you this softly because it is a hard thing, and I do not want it to frighten you, but only to help you understand the world this gentle man had to govern. A world where a great dying moved through the land like a shadow, and there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it, and Marcus met even this the way he met everything, without panic and without abandoning his post, giving what help the state could give, selling off the palace treasures at one point to pay for the wars and the relief rather than crush the people with new taxes, and staying, always staying, at the work in front of him. And if the plague were not enough, the earth itself seemed to turn against them in those years, for the great river Tiber rose and flooded Rome, drowning fields and stores of grain, and famine followed the flood. And the poor grew hungry, and it must have seemed to the people that the gods had simply turned their faces away. And through all of it, Marcus did the plain next thing, and the next, because that was the only way he knew to live, one duty and then the following duty, without complaint, and while the plague still moved through the empire, and the memory of the flood was still fresh. The greatest and longest trouble of his whole life came down upon him from the north, from the cold country beyond the river Danube, where the tribes the Romans called the Marcomanni and the Quadi and their many allies came pouring across the frontier, in such numbers that they broke through and swept down into the Roman provinces, some of them reaching almost into Italy itself, further than any such enemy had come in living memory. And so the philosopher who had wanted a quiet life of books had to leave Rome and go north to the war. And here is where you must settle deeper into your pillow, because this is where the rest of his life was spent, not in marble halls, but in plain camps on a freezing frontier, year after year after year. In the mud and the snow and the endless grey work of holding a border that never wanted to stay held, and the two brothers went north together to face it, But Lucius Verus did not last long. For on one of the journeys back toward Rome, he was struck down suddenly by illness, a stroke it seems, and died in the year 169, still a fairly young man, and so Marcus was left alone at the top of the world, the sole emperor now, no brother to share the weight with, just him and the duty and the cold. And he grieved his brother quietly, as he grieved everything quietly, and he buried him with honour and turned back to the war. Because the war did not pause for grief, the war never paused for anything, and so began the long grey heart of his life, the frontier years, and I want you to picture it now gently, the way you might picture a scene in a story just before sleep takes you. Picture a great river running cold through a northern land, and on the near bank the Roman camps, rows of tents and earthworks and the smoke of small fires, and beyond the river the dark forests where the enemy waited. And picture the seasons turning over that camp again and again, the short summers and the long hard winters, the snow lying deep on the tent roofs, the breath of the horses steaming in the frozen dawn. And picture, somewhere in the middle of all that, in one tent no grander than it needed to be, a tired man in middle age, the master of the whole known world, sitting late by the light of a single small flame. And here at last we come to the thing that outlasted everything, because that man, alone at night when the day's orders were given and the maps rolled up and the camp gone quiet, did not sit there brooding or drinking or plotting. He took up a pen and he began to write, not to his officers, not to the Senate, not to history, but to himself, in Greek, the language of the philosophy he loved, small private notes and reminders and consolations meant for no eyes but his own. A kind of quiet conversation with his own tired heart, telling himself to be patient, to be just, to do his duty, to remember how small and brief all troubles are, to be ready for death without fear. And he never gave this notebook a title, and he surely never dreamed that anyone would ever read it. It was simply the way he steadied himself, the way a man might talk himself calm in the dark, and yet that little private book, written by one lamp in a cold tent for no one at all, would survive, by luck and accident, down through 1600 years. And we would come to call it the Meditations, and strangers he never met, in lands he never heard of, would read it and be comforted, perhaps even you, perhaps even tonight. And there is something so gentle and so surprising in that the most private thing a man ever wrote would become the thing the whole world remembers him by. And now and then in those frontier years there came a strange bright moment in the middle of all the grey, and one of them has come down to us as a legend, hedged and softened by all the tellings between then and now. The story that once, when a Roman force was surrounded and desperate, trapped without water under a burning sky, close to perishing of thirst, a sudden rain came out of nowhere and saved them, breaking the enemy with a storm and filling the parched soldiers' mouths with water. And the people afterward called it a miracle, and argued for centuries about whose God had sent it, and whether it happened quite the way the story says, or grew a little larger in the retelling we cannot truly know. And it does not much matter for our purposes tonight. It is only one more small strange light in the long dark stretch of those frontier years, a moment when it seemed the sky itself took pity, and then the war went on as before, and it went on for years, and Marcus grew older in the camps, and his health, never strong, wore thinner, and still he stayed. And then, in the year 175, there came a wound of a different kind, not from the enemy beyond the river, but from within, from a man he had trusted, because far away in the east one of his own most capable generals, a man named Ovidius Cassius, who had governed the eastern provinces well, and whom Marcus had relied upon, suddenly declared himself emperor, having heard a rumour, a false rumour, that Marcus had fallen ill and died, and so believing the throne empty Cassius reached for it, and for a moment it seemed the empire might tear itself in two, the north against the east. And here again you see the quality of the man, because when Marcus learned of the revolt he did not fly into rage, he grieved. He was sorrowful more than angry, sorry that a good man had gone wrong, and he spoke, we are told, of wishing above all to win the traitor back rather than destroy him, of wanting to show mercy, to forgive, to prove that even a betrayal could be met without cruelty. And he prepared to go east not with fury, but with the hope of setting things right gently. And in the end he never had to face that choice at all. Because before the two men could meet, Cassius was struck down by his own soldiers, killed by his own side when they saw the rebellion was hopeless. And so the revolt collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen, and Marcus, who had wanted only to forgive, was denied even the chance to show his mercy, and he mourned the waste of it, the sad, needless waste. And he ordered that the dead man's letters be burned unread, so that he need not know who else had been disloyal, so that he would not have to carry that bitterness which is a small quiet thing to do and tells you so much about him. And yet even in the sorrow of that journey east, to settle the shaken provinces there was waiting for him one more private grief, the deepest of all perhaps. Because his wife Faustina, who had been at his side through all the long years and borne him so many children, most of whom had died young, one small grave after another, a lifelong tally of quiet losses that he had carried without bitterness. Faustina herself died on that eastern journey, in that same year, and so he lost her too, the companion of his whole adult life, and he mourned her in his steady, quiet way, and asked that she be honoured. And then he turned, as he always turned, back to the work, back to the frontier, back to the cold, because the tribes were stirring again beyond the river and the war was not finished, and he was an old man now by the reckoning of those days, worn thin by decades of duty and illness and grief. And still he went back north, back to the camps and the snow and the single lamp in the tent, to hold the border a little longer, and you can feel, can't you, how tired he must have been, and how he never once laid the burden down, and it was there, on that northern frontier in the early spring of the year 180, that the long life finally came to its close, for the illness that had shadowed him for years, perhaps the very plague he had watched empty his cities, took hold of him at last and would not let go, and he knew, being the kind of man he was, exactly what was coming, and he met it the way he had spent a lifetime teaching himself to meet it, without struggle and without fear, setting his affairs in order, thinking of the empire he would leave behind, and it is told, though we must hold this softly as the sort of thing that gathers around a great man's end and may have grown in the telling, that when those around his bed began to weep for him, he told them not to weep for him at all, but to weep instead for the plague and for all the many dead, and to turn their thoughts away from his own passing toward the larger sorrow of the world, and that near the very end, when the guard came as always for the watchword. He gave one final time the direction of his whole life, telling them to go to the rising sun, for he himself was already setting, and then, at 58 years old, worn out in the service of a world he had never wanted to rule, the last of the good emperors let go of his breath and was gone, out on the cold frontier far from the marble of home and the one great shadow he left behind. The one thing his careful lifelong goodness could not arrange was his son, the boy Commodus, whom he had raised up to follow him and on whom he had set his hopes. For Commodus would not turn out to be the man his father was, and the golden line of good rulers that had held for so long would end with him. And that is history's quiet heartbreak, folded into this gentle one, the good tired father and the son who would not carry the light. But we will come to all of that softly in its time, and for now let us simply hold the shape of it, this whole long life laid out end to end, the honest boy who became the reluctant emperor, who ruled through plague and flood and betrayal and endless war, and never stopped doing his plain duty, and never stopped. Alone at night by one small flame, writing himself back to calm, and perhaps that is the truest first measure of him, that of all the things a man in his place might have chosen to leave behind, palaces or monuments or boastful stones, he left behind only his own private kindness to himself, written down. And that is the thing that lasted, and now that you know the whole shape of it, first breath to last, the wars and the losses and the quiet steady goodness running under all of it like a river under ice, you can let it settle over you like a warm blanket settling, because there is nothing left in it to fear, only a good tired man doing his best in a hard world. And the same stars over him then as over you now, and the lamp still burning beside you, patient and low. And we are not finished, not nearly. We have only walked the whole path once, quickly, the way you might glance down a road you are about to take at your leisure. And now we will go back and walk it again, far more slowly, and linger in the rooms and the years, and there is no hurry at all, none whatsoever, because the lamp will burn as long as you need it to. And now that you know the shape of the whole life, first breath to last, let us go back to the beginning, gently, and walk through it more slowly, lingering in the rooms and the years, because there is no hurry at all, and the lamp will burn as long as you need it to, and he will still be here when we arrive, the same tired, kind man, only younger now, only a boy again, waiting for us at the start. And there is something worth saying before we set off on this slower road, something the first quick walk could not quite hold, which is that the wonder of this particular life is not really the wars, and it is not really the titles, and it is not the plague, or the flood, or the frontier, or any of the loud and heavy things that a life like his gathers around it, like snow gathering on a wall. Because if you strip all of that away, all the marble and the armies and the great turning machine of the empire, what is left? The thing that has come down the 1600 years to us, and still glows faintly in the dark, is something much quieter, and much smaller, and much stranger, which is the quality of one man's attention to his own soul, the care he took, night after night, with the inside of himself, the way another man might take care of a garden or a horse or a small child, tending it, correcting it, forgiving it, reminding it gently and over of the few things that matter. And so if you remember nothing else of tonight, if you drift off in the next breath and never hear the end, let that be the thread you carry down into sleep, that here was a man who paid attention to his own heart with the same seriousness that the world demanded he pay to its problems, and that this, more than any battle, is what we have come back to walk through slowly. And so let us begin where all of it began, in the great city, in the warm noon of an empire that did not yet know it was as high as it would ever climb, because you have to see the city to understand the boy, and you have to see the city as it was then, and not as the ruin we know now, all broken columns and grass between the stones, but whole and loud and living and impossibly rich. Rome in the 2nd century after the birth of Christ, the largest city the Western world had ever built, more than 1 million souls packed onto its 7 low hills, and if you could stand in it on the day this boy was born, on the 26th of April in the year 121, you would hear before you saw anything at all the sound of water, because Rome then was a city of water, of great arched aqueducts marching in from the hills carrying rivers on their shoulders, so that the city ran with it, in fountains on the corners, and in the enormous heated baths where half the city bathed each afternoon. And you would smell bread baking in 1,000 ovens and smoke rising from 1,000 small fires and the warm animal smell of the crowds, and you would see marble everywhere. Not the bleached white marble of the museums, but marble painted in bright colours, reds and blues and gold, temples and columns and the huge public buildings all painted like toys, gleaming in the strong Italian sun, and you would see people from every corner of the known world, because everything flowed to Rome then, grain from Egypt and glass from Syria and tin from the far cold islands in the northern spices carried overland from beyond the edge of the maps, all of it pouring into this one hungry glittering city, and over it all, invisible and everywhere, the empire itself, the vast patient machine of roads and law and soldiers and taxes that held the whole thing together, that let a merchant travel safely from the sands of Africa to the green hills of Britain on paved roads under. One law and one coin, and this was the world at what people would later call its unworried noon, the long calm afternoon of the Roman peace, when the borders were quiet enough and the harvests were good enough, and the great troubles all still lay ahead, sleeping, and into this world, into a comfortable and honourable corner of it, the boy was born. And I want you to picture the house he was born into. Not a palace, not yet. Only the large and dignified house of a well-off senatorial family. A family that had made its money and its name over the generations. Decent people. The kind of people who served the state and paid their debts and did not make a fuss. And the house would have been built the Roman way, turned inward and away from the noisy street, so that its rooms opened onto a quiet courtyard open to the sky, with a little pool in the middle to catch the rain, and a garden further in, and colonnades of painted columns to walk under out of the sun. Cool tiled floors, walls painted with soft scenes of birds and gardens, and far blue distances. And it would have been, above all, a calm house. An orderly house, and this matters, because the calm of that house got into the boy and never left him, and he was born Marcus Annius Verus, given the family name, and that last part of it, Verus, is a small thing, but a lovely one, because it means true, the truthful one, and it ran in the family like the colour of the eyes, and it would come to fit this particular child so well that people made a gentle joke of it later, but we are getting ahead, and there is no hurry, so let us stay in the house. In the early years where the first great sorrow of his life was waiting, because his father, also called Marcus Annius Verus, the man he was named for, died while the boy was still very small. So small that afterward he could barely remember him at all, only, he tells us in that private book, a kind of impression, a leftover feeling of modesty and of a quiet manliness, of a man who did not need to raise his voice or make himself large, and that is a tender and a heartbreaking thing when you sit with it, that all a grown man kept of his own father was the shape of a certain quietness, a certain steadiness, and yet notice, and this is so much like him, that he kept it not as a wound but as a lesson, that he took even this early loss and turned it gently into an example, into something to live up to, and so the boy grew up in a house of women and old men, raised largely by his mother and his grandfather, and here is where the character got its grain, here in these plain rooms, because his mother, Domitia Lucilla, was by every account a fine woman, wealthy in her own right, owning great brickworks outside the city, but frugal, careful, unshowy. A woman who could have lived in luxury and chose instead to live simply. And the boy watched her, the way children watch, taking it all in without seeming to, and he remembered later, with real love, the simplicity of her table and how far her way of living was from the rich habits of the rich. And he remembered his grandfather too, in whose house he grew up, remembered him for a good temper and a gentleness. And all around him were the tutors, because a boy of that class was educated with enormous care from the very start, handed from teacher to teacher, and he remembered them one by one in that book, each with a small specific gift. This one who taught him not to take sides at the races and not to get worked up over trifles. That one who taught him to work with his own hands and to mind his own business and not to listen to gossip. Another who taught him to write plainly and to give up affectation. And you can see, can't you, even from this little list, the shape of the man being poured slowly into the child, the whole cool, careful, modest kindness of it, laid down layer on layer like the sediment that makes a stone. And it is worth pausing on the honesty especially, on the truthfulness that gave him his name and then earned it again. Because the story goes that the old emperor himself, Hadrian, who ruled in those years, a brilliant, restless, clever man, took notice of this serious little boy, watched him at the ceremonies and the family gatherings, and was so struck by how utterly incapable the child seemed of telling a lie, how plainly and simply honest he was, that he took to calling him not Verus, his real name, but Verissimus, which is just the same word turned all the way up. Most truthful, the truest of the true, and whether it happened exactly so, or whether it grew a little in the fond retelling, as these stories do, it is far too fitting to leave out, because it tells you the one thing everyone who ever met this boy seemed to agree on, that he was, from the very beginning, honest all the way down, honest the way water is wet, and that a powerful old emperor near the end of his own crowded life looked at that quality in a child and found it worth remarking on, worth a nickname, worth remembering, and so the boy grew, serious and truthful and gently raised. And somewhere in his teenage years the thing happened that would define the whole rest of his life. The thing we have come back tonight most of all to sit beside, which is that he fell in love, and what he fell in love with was philosophy. And I want to be careful and slow here because the word philosophy has grown hard and dusty and academic over the centuries, and it was nothing of the kind to him. It was not a subject, and it was not a career. It was a way of living, and a way of dying, and a way of getting up in the morning. It was the most alive thing in his whole young world, and he took to it the way another boy might take to the sea, or to horses, or to a first love, completely seriously, with his whole self, and it changed even how he dressed and how he slept, because he took up the rough, plain woolen cloak of the Greek. Philosophers, the coarse and simple garment of men who had turned their backs on comfort and finery, and he wore it, this rich boy in his fine house. And more than that, he took to sleeping the way those hard old teachers said one should, on the bare ground, on a plain board or on the floor with the thinnest of coverings, because the body was to be mastered and not indulged. And you can picture it so easily, this earnest young man lying on the hard floor of a warm, rich house, freezing himself on purpose, disciplining himself on purpose, in love with the idea of hardness. And you can picture too his mother, Domitia Lucilla, frugal, careful Domitia, coming to find her boy shivering on the boards, and gently, patiently, the way mothers do, coaxing him back up onto a proper couch, back to a bed, telling him surely he could be good and serious and wise, and also, just also, sleep like a person. And there is something in that small scene, that tug between the boy who wanted to be hard on himself and the mother who wanted him warm. That is the whole of him in miniature, and it is a good thing to hold while you lie there tonight. Warm yourself, under your own soft covering, that even the great self-disciplined emperor was once a boy his mother had to talk into a bed. And so what was it? This philosophy he fell so hard for. And here I want to slow right down and speak plainly. Because these ideas are old, and they are simple, and they are, I think, genuinely soothing, genuinely the right medicine for a mind that is trying to let go of the day and sink towards sleep. And the school he loved was the one we call Stoicism, an old Greek way of thinking that had come to Rome and taken root there among serious men, and if you boil away all the technical parts, which we can happily do at this hour, it comes down to just a few plain ideas that a tired heart can rest on. And the first is this, that almost nothing that happens to us is really in our control. Not the weather, not other people, not our health in the end, not what the world does to us or takes from us, none of it. All of that belongs to fortune and to nature, and will do as it pleases regardless of our wishes. But there is one thing, one small thing, that is truly and completely ours, and that is how we meet what happens, the inner response, the judgment we make, the attitude we take up, whether we meet the day with resentment or with acceptance, whether we let a thing crush us or carry us, and that, they said, that little inner space, is the only kingdom you truly rule, and so wisdom is learning to let go of your grip on everything else, on all the things you cannot hold anyway, and to tend only that one small garden that is actually yours. And doesn't that already loosen something in the chest? Just to hear it. That you can set down tonight every single thing outside this room, every worry about what other people will do and what tomorrow will bring, and keep only the one soft task of meeting it well when it comes. And there is more, and it is gentler still. Because the second great idea is that nature, the whole vast turning of everything, is one single connected whole. One great living order of which you are a small and natural and belonging part. Not a stranger dropped into a hostile world, but a piece of the world itself, made of the same stuff as the stars and the sea and the earth, born out of the whole and destined to return to it, and so nothing that happens according to nature can really be against you. Because you are not separate from nature, you are nature, briefly awake and looking around, and the third idea follows softly from that. And it is the one he returned to more than any other, and the one that is perhaps the deepest sleep medicine of all, which is that death is nothing to fear, that death is simply natural as birth, as natural as an apple falling ripe from a tree or a wave sinking back into the sea, only a returning of your borrowed pieces to the great whole that lent them. A change and not an ending, the same door you came in by, and that all the countless generations before you have passed through it easily, and all the generations after you will too, and that there is nothing in it to dread, nothing at all, only a lying down, only a letting go, only, in the end, a kind of sleep, and you can feel, I hope, why a man carrying the whole weight of the world would reach for these ideas again and again by lamplight, and why they still work, why they still loosen the knot in the chest, because they take everything that frightens us, all the great looming things, and they make them soft and small and natural and bearable. And now here is the lovely human part of how these ideas came to him. Because ideas do not arrive out of the air, they come through people, through teachers, and he had wonderful ones and he loved them. And the one to hold on to is a man named Rusticus, a serious stoic, older, respected, who became to the young Marcus something like the guide of his inner life, and Marcus never forgot what he owed him, and above all he never forgot one particular gift, one particular day, because it was Rusticus who put into his hands a worn old book, a set of lecture notes taken down from the teachings of a man named Epictetus. And here is the thing that ought to make you smile as you drift. That Epictetus, whose worn book set the future emperor's soul on fire and steadied it for the rest of his life, had himself been born a slave, an actual slave, lame in one leg, owned by another man, and had won his freedom and become a teacher. And taught exactly this, that no master can touch the one free kingdom inside you, that a slave in chains can be freer in his soul than an emperor on a throne, and that the same truths hold for the highest and the lowest of men, because we are all equally small under the same turning sky. And so the richest and most powerful young man in the world sat reading, over and over until the pages wore soft, the words of a freed slave, and took them as the truest thing he had ever encountered, and built his whole inner life on them. And there is a gentleness in that, a levelling, that is worth carrying down into the dark. And he had a warmer teacher too, of a different kind, an old man named Fronto, his tutor in words and speech and letters. And with Fronto it was less philosophy and more affection, a real friendship carried across the years in letters that still survive, letters full of small human warmth, complaints about a sore throat, worry over each other's health, teasing, tenderness. An old teacher and his brilliant young pupil writing back and forth, simply because they were fond of one another. And it is good to know that this grave and disciplined young man had that too, ordinary affection, ordinary friendship, someone to write to about nothing much, because a life is not all high ideas, a life is also letters about your cough. And now, with the boy grown into a serious, loving young man, steeped in philosophy, tender with his teachers, dressing plainly and living simply and tending the small garden of his own soul, the great tide of the outer world came for him at last. Because Hadrian, the old emperor who had noticed the truthful child, was dying without a son to follow him, and had to arrange the whole future of the world from his sickbed. And he did it, as we walked through more quickly before, by reaching down through the generations and setting this young man on the path to the throne, arranging that he be adopted into the imperial family through the kindly hands of a man named Antoninus, whom we call Antoninus Pius, Antoninus the Dutiful, and here I want to linger, because this next stretch of his life, the long patient years of learning under Antoninus, was in its own quiet way the making of him, and it is worth walking slowly. Because Antoninus Pius was, by every account we have, simply a good ruler and a good man, and he became for Marcus the living example he would spend the rest of his life trying to imitate. the picture he kept in his mind of what a decent man in power should look like. And what was he like, this Antoninus? Well, he was mild, and he was patient, and he was frugal in his own habits though generous with the state, and he was not vain, and he did not go looking for wars or glory or grand gestures, and he ruled for over 20 years so calmly and so well that there is almost nothing dramatic to say about his reign, which is itself the highest kind of praise. Because the happiest countries are the ones with the quietest histories, and Marcus lived beside this man for years and years, at his side watching him work, learning the endless patient unglamorous business of holding a world together. The reading of reports, the hearing of disputes, the weighing of decisions, the sheer daily grind of it. And he tells us in that private book, in one of its most loving passages, everything he learned from watching. Antoninus, and it reads like a portrait drawn by someone who studied every line of the face, that Antoninus was gentle, that he was steady, that he finished what he examined thoroughly and did not act on first impressions, that he bore with people who criticised him unfairly and never lost his temper, that he took what comforts fortune gave him without fuss and did without them without complaint. When they were gone, that he was neither harsh nor soft but reasonable, that he honoured real philosophers and did not scold the rest, that he worked hard and kept the same friends and was never faddish, and above all that he was master of himself, cheerful, and even in his manners entirely without show. And you can hear, can't you, in that long loving list, a young man memorising a life, taking careful notes on how to be good, storing up in his heart the model he would reach for on all the cold hard nights that were still ahead of him, all the nights we will come to soon, when the mild years were over and the weight came down. And so the apprenticeship went on, patient and long 23 years of it, the young man ripening slowly beside the good old ruler, married by now to Faustina, learning the work, wearing the burden more heavily each year as Antoninus aged. And there is a stillness to these years, a long golden afternoon of preparation, and it is a good place to rest for a moment before the harder road. But rest is all it was, because the burden was coming, the whole weight of the world was coming, and it would land on him soon enough, on the day the good old man finally laid it down. And so the quiet boy, who had wanted nothing more than his books and his rough grey cloak, and the long slow afternoons of thinking, became, in the fullness of time and without ever once asking for it, the master of the whole wide Roman world. And it is worth sitting with that a moment tonight, gently, the way you might sit with a thought at the edge of sleep, because there is something in it that goes to the very heart of the man, the way a life can hand you the exact opposite of what you longed for and ask you to carry it anyway, and the way a truly good soul will simply pick it up and carry it, not gladly perhaps, not with any great show of eagerness, but steadily, one day after another. The way a patient ox pulls a plough it did not choose across a field it did not plant, and that is what Marcus did year upon year, and did without complaint, or at least without complaint that anyone could hear. Though of course we shall come in a little while to the one place where he did let himself say, softly, to no one but himself, by a single small flame, how tired he sometimes was, and how heavy it all could be. But before we come to that quiet tent in the snow, let us stay a while longer here at the beginning of the reign, in the warmer years, and remember the brother who ruled beside him, because this too tells you something tender about the shape of Marcus's heart. That when the old Emperor Antoninus Pius at last laid down his life, and the whole weight of the empire came down onto Marcus's shoulders, the very first thing this newly made ruler of the world did was to insist that he should not rule it alone, that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus should be raised up beside him as a full and equal emperor, sharing the titles and the power and the burden, and this had never quite been done before in just this way, 2 emperors together at the head of Rome. And Marcus did it not because he was forced to, and not because it was clever, but because it seemed to him only fair and only kind, since they had been raised as brothers under the same roof by the same good man, and it did not seem right to Marcus to take everything for himself and leave his brother with nothing, and so he shared it, freely, the way you might halve the last of the bread with someone you had grown up beside, and if you know anything of how men usually behave when a throne is set before them, you will feel how rare and how gentle a thing that was. And the two of them were not much alike, these brothers. And here I want to be careful and kind, because it would be easy to be hard on Lucius Verus, and easy is not the same as true, and the register of this quiet room is never harshness, but it is fair to say that where Marcus was sober and plain and inward, a man happiest with a book and a lamp and a small meal and an early bed, Lucius was fond of the brighter and warmer pleasures of the world, the games and the feasting and the horses and the good wine and the long glittering nights, and he wore his purple more easily and enjoyed it more openly, and he had by all the old accounts a lightness and a charm that Marcus perhaps did not, and there is no need to scold him for it across 1600 years, for he did his duty when it was asked of him. He went east and stood at the head of the armies in the war against Parthia, and the war was won. And if he took his ease along the way, that is only to say that he was a man like most men, reaching for comfort where he could, and Marcus, for his part, never seems to have reproached him with any bitterness, but only, in that private notebook we shall come to, reminded himself now and then, softly, that other people are as they are, and that it is not for us to be forever correcting them, and that a man does better to mind the plainness and honesty of his own soul than to grow sour over the softness of another's, and so he simply carried the heavier share himself, quietly, and let his brother be his brother, and there is a kind of love in that, in the not correcting, in the letting be, and it is a love worth resting on for a moment as your breathing slows, and Lucius, as you already know, for we walked the whole shape of the life through once already, Lucius did not live to grow old. He died still fairly young, some years into the reign, on the road, suddenly, and Marcus buried him with all the honour of an emperor, and grieved him as a brother, and after that carried the whole weight quite alone, which brings us gently now, without any hurry, to the great long image at the very centre of this man's life. The picture I would like you to hold as you drift, because if you keep only one picture of Marcus Aurelius, it should perhaps be this one, and it is not the marble palace in Rome, and it is not the bronze horseman on the hill, and it is not the crowds and the trumpets and the triumphs, it is a plain tent in the northern snow. So let yourself picture it now, slowly, the way you would picture a room you are being led toward with your eyes half closed, far away from Rome, far away from the fountains and the marble and the warm blue southern sky, up on the cold grey edge of the world along the great slow river the Romans called the Danube, where the empire ended and the deep forests of the northern tribes began, and where the winters come down hard and early, and the ground goes iron with frost, and the breath of men and horses hangs white in the air, and there, in a camp of many tents, ringed by ditches and stakes, and the plain hard business of an army at war, in a tent no grander than it needed to be, with the wind moving against the cloth and the cold pressing in at the seams, sat the master of the whole known world, a tired man past the middle of his life, wrapped in a soldier's cloak against the chill, doing the endless grinding work that the frontier asked of him, year after year after year. And I want you to feel how long that was, how it was not one heroic winter, but many, one after another, the marching and the councils and the reports and the supplies and the sick and the dead, and the messengers coming and going, and the tribes across the river pressing and retreating and pressing again. An endless dull machinery of defending a border he took no joy in defending, in a war he had never wanted, in a cold he must have hated, because he was a southern man, a man of warm stone and sunlight, and yet he stayed for years, because it was his duty and there was no one else to do it. And that word duty, which can sound so dry and so grey, becomes something you can almost touch when you set it there in that cold tent, in the person of that tired man who would so much rather have been home among his books, staying anyway, doing the plain next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next. And now here is the part that matters most of all. the part that reaches all the way down the centuries to you, lying warm in your own room tonight with your own small light beside you. Because at the end of those long grinding days, when the councils were done and the reports were read, and the camp had gone quiet under thee, Snow, this tired emperor, did not send for wine or music or company. He lit a single small lamp, one flame in all that darkness, and he took out a plain notebook, and by that one flame, in Greek, the language he thought was best for careful. Thinking, he began to write, and what he wrote was not orders, and it was not the history of his wars, and it was not a message for the Senate, or a letter to his generals, or anything at all that he ever meant another living soul to read. It was something far quieter and far stranger than that. It was a set of reminders to his own tired heart, little notes from Marcus to Marcus, written only to steady himself, only to get himself through. And this is the book that by the sheerest accident survived when so much else was lost, and that we now, 1600 years later, call the Meditations, though he never gave it any title at all, because a man does not title the private things he says to himself in the dark. And let us go very gently now through the kinds of things he wrote there, not inventing any of it, only paraphrasing softly and truly. Because these are, I think, among the most soothing thoughts a tired person can be given at the end of a long day, and they were written by a tired person at the end of a long day. So they fit this hour exactly, and the first of them, the one people remember best. He seems to have written to himself in the mornings, before the day began, when he had to rise in the cold and go out and deal with people, and it is not a grand thought at all, it is almost funny in its plainness. For he told himself, more or less, that when he woke he should say to himself, "Today I will meet with people who are meddlesome and ungrateful, and proud and dishonest and unkind. And I will meet them not because the world is broken, but simply because that is how some people are, and I must not be surprised by it, and I must not be poisoned by it. Because I know the difference between right and wrong, and I know that these people are, underneath everything, my own kin, made of the same stuff, sharing the same reason and the same brief life, and so I cannot truly be angry with them or turned against them, but must simply be patient and go on doing my own part well, and think how gentle a thing that is, to tell yourself before the day even begins that the difficult people you will meet are not a nasty surprise, but simply the weather, simply part of what it is to live among others, and that you will meet them with patience, because it is not in you to do otherwise, and how much of the day's sting is drawn out in advance by that one quiet resolve taken alone, before dawn, in the cold. And he wrote to himself too, over and over, in many different ways, about how small all our troubles really are. And this one, I think, is the deepest of his medicines, and the one most suited to this drifting hour, because he had a way of pulling back from his own worries, the way you might pull a lamp back from a page until the whole page can be seen at once, and looking at his own brief life against the vast slow turning of everything. And he would remind himself that the whole earth is a small point in the enormous emptiness of things, and that the span of any life, even an emperor's life, even a long one, is only a moment against the endless backward reach of time and its endless forward reach, and that all the men who fretted and schemed and struggled before us are gone now, every one, the great and the small alike, back into the same quiet ground, and that we shall go there too, soon enough, and be as forgotten as they are, and that this is not a bitter thought, but a freeing one, because if it is all so brief and so small, then the things we torment ourselves over are brief and small as well, the slight someone gave us, the thing we did not get, the worry that kept us awake, all of it soft and passing against the great turning of the stars, which were wheeling over Rome then exactly as they wheel over your roof tonight, the very same stars, unbothered, unhurried, going their slow round whether we fret or whether we sleep. And he liked to remind himself that everything is always changing, that nothing stays, that the world is like a river always flowing on, and that this too is not to be feared, but to be leaned into, because change is simply the way of nature, the way of the whole great single living thing that he believed the world to be, of which we are each a small and passing part, a wave that rises for a moment on the water and then sinks back into it, not lost, only returned, and out of all this he drew, again and again, a calm and steady looking at death itself. And here I will go softly, as we always do in this room when death is near. Because he thought about death a great deal, this emperor, more than most men let themselves, and yet his thinking on it is not dark at all. It is one of the most consoling things in the whole book. For he told himself simply that death is a natural thing, as natural as being born, that the same nature that brought us here will take us away again, and that there is nothing shameful or frightening in something so natural, that the leaf falls, and the fruit ripens and drops, and the old give way to the young as they always have, and that a man who has lived well and done his part has no reason to cling and no reason to be afraid, but can lay the whole thing down when the time comes as gently as a traveller lies down at the end of the road, tired and satisfied and ready for rest, and he seemed to draw a real and quiet comfort from this, and so, I hope, may you, lying there tonight with the day behind you, that the letting go, when it finally comes, whether tonight into sleep or one far distant day into the longer rest, is only a natural thing, and nothing to be feared, and threaded through all of it, through the patience and the smallness and the acceptance of change and of death, was one plain iron thread that held the whole man together, and it was this, that whatever else was uncertain, the one thing always in his power was to do the next right thing, plainly and without complaint, the duty in front of him, the task of the hour, whatever it happened to be, whether great or small, a battle or a letter or a kindness to a servant, and that a life is really only made up of such moments, one plain duty after another met well, and that if he simply did each one as it came, honestly and without fuss, and without whining about how heavy it all was, then he had done everything that could be asked of a man, and the rest, the outcome, the reward, the fame, the whether it lasted. None of that was his to control, and so none of it was worth his worry, and so he did the next thing. And the next, in the cold, for years, and wrote himself these small reminders by the small flame when the day was done, and folded the notebook away, and slept a little, and rose in the dark, and did it all again, and I have not yet told you, though you already know it from our first walk through the whole life, of the private sorrows he carried inside all this, quietly, the way he carried everything quietly, and we should speak of them now, gently, because a man is not only his duties, and Marcus grieved as deeply as any of us, only more silently, for he and his wife Faustina had many children across the long years of their marriage, and here is one of the softest and saddest of all the true things about him, that most of those children did not live, that one after another the little ones were lost, some as babies and some as small children, buried young, again and again, so that of all the many he fathered, only a few grew up at all, and you have only to be a parent, or to have loved a child, to feel what a long, slow grief that must have been, coming back and back across the years, and yet you will search that private notebook almost in vain for any loud cry of it. For he did not rail and he did not curse the world, he only reminded himself, softly, that those he loved were lent to him and not given, that they came from nature and returned to nature, that to lose what was never truly ours to keep is not a robbery but only the way of things, and he told himself to be grateful for having had them at all rather than embittered at their going, and whether that consolation truly reached all the way down to the bottom of his grief we cannot know. No one can know another's heart in such a place, but it is a tender thing to watch a man reach for it, over and over, and try to steady himself with it, and go on, and the brother we spoke of, Lucius, gone too, in the middle of it all, and then, in the later years, out on the long eastern journey, Faustina herself, his wife of so many years, the companion of his whole-grown life, she died as well, and left him truly alone, and he grieved her too in his quiet way, and asked that she be honoured, and went on, because there was always more to be gone on with, and there was one more sorrow in those middle years that I must set down gently, because it wounded him in a different place, not in the heart's love but in the heart's trust, and it was the sorrow of a man he had believed in turning against him, for far. Away in the east there was a general named Avidius Cassius, a strong and capable man whom Marcus had trusted with great power and great armies, and word went about, on a rumour that was not even true, that Marcus had at last died of one of his illnesses out on the frontier, and on the strength of that false rumour Cassius let himself be declared emperor in the east. And so of a sudden the tired man in the cold tent, who had troubles enough already, found himself facing a rebellion led by one of his own. And here is the thing that tells you, once more, what manner of man he was. For there is no sign that Marcus met this with rage or with any thirst to punish, but rather with a deep and weary sorrow that it had come to this. And it is said, and I give it to you softly as a thing believed, that his wish was not to destroy Cassius, but to reach him, and if he possibly could, to forgive him, to show the world that even a betrayal could be met with mercy, that he would rather win the man back than crush him, and that a good ruler is one who can pardon, and whether he would truly have managed such mercy in the end, we shall never know. Because it never came to a meeting, for Cassius was killed by his own soldiers before the two men ever stood face to face, and when they brought Marcus the news, and even, so the old story goes, the dead man's head, he is said to have turned away from it, unwilling to look, grieved rather than gladdened, robbed of the very chance to be merciful that he had most wanted. And he treated the rebel's family and followers afterward with a gentleness that astonished people who expected the usual bloody reckoning, and so you see the whole shape of him now, held up quietly in the lamplight. The gentle philosopher who was handed the whole crushing weight of the world, and did not put it down, who shared his power when he could have kept it, who met difficult people with patience and betrayal with sorrow, who lost his children and his brother and his wife, and bore it all without bitterness, who stayed in the cold doing the plain hard thing year after year, and who, when each long day was finally over, lit one small flame and wrote himself these quiet reminders to be patient, and to remember how small our troubles are, and to do the next right thing, and not to fear the natural end of all things, never once dreaming that the private notes he made only to get himself through the night would one day be the thing the whole world remembered him by, the thing that would outlast the empire and the wars and the marble, and would still be read, still be a comfort, still be a hand laid gently on a tired shoulder in the dark, all these long centuries later, in rooms he could never have imagined, perhaps even in this one, tonight. And he was growing older now, through all of this, and more tired, and the illnesses that had troubled him all his life were pressing harder, and the frontier still would not let him go home. And so we come, slowly and without any hurry at all, the lamp still burning beside you, to the last of it, to the worn and gentle close of the whole long dutiful life, and to the one sorrow he could not mend, and the one hope he could not secure. Waiting for us there at the end of the road, and so the years went on gathering on his shoulders the way the snow gathered on the ridgepole of the tent, quietly, a little more each winter, until the man by the lamp was no longer the grave young student in the rough grey cloak, nor even the careful middle-aged ruler who had taken up the reins so unwillingly, but an old man now, or old as men were counted then, worn thin by the cold and the marching and the long carrying of a weight he had never asked to lift. And you can picture him, if you like, in these last years, not standing tall on any bronze horse, but sitting, tired, a little stooped over the small table in the tent, his hands not quite as steady as they once were, his stomach uneasy so that he ate very little and slept less, and yet still, morning after morning, rising to do the plain grey work of the day, because that was the only way he knew how to be. And there is something in that picture worth holding on to tonight. The way a very tired man kept getting up, not because he wanted to, not because anyone would have blamed him for stopping, but simply because it was his to do. And he did it. And if you are tired yourself tonight, if the day was long and the weight of your own small duties felt heavy, then let him keep you gentle company here in the lamplight, because he understood that kind of tiredness better than almost anyone who ever lived, and he never once, in all the pages he wrote to himself, asked to be pitied for it. He only reminded himself, softly, to keep going and to keep kind. And now the frontier that had eaten so much of his life was quieter than it had been. The tribes across the river beaten back at last, or beaten down, or simply exhausted the way he himself was exhausted, and there was even talk in those last years of finishing the long work for good, of pushing the boundary out and settling the northern lands, and making an end of the wars that had run like a cold grey thread through his whole reign, so that a man might finally lay down the sword and go home to the warmth and the books and the quiet he had wanted since he was a boy sleeping on the bare ground in his mother's house. And whether he truly believed he would ever see that rest, or whether he had made his peace long ago with the likelihood that he would die out here in the cold with the work unfinished, we cannot fully know. But the notebook by the lamp gives us a hint, because in it he told himself over and over and in a dozen gentle ways that no life is ever really unfinished, that a thing which has done what it could in the time it was given is complete in itself, the way a single day is whole even if it is short, the way a small flower that opens in the morning and closes by night has lived a full flower's life, and asks for nothing more, and so he was ready, in the way that a decent man who has thought long about death becomes ready, not eager, not despairing, only quiet, only willing. And there was one grief in those closing years that even all his philosophy could not fully soften, one shadow he could see coming and could not turn aside, and it was the shadow of his own son, and we will speak of it gently, as he would have wished, without harshness and without blame, because the boy's name was Commodus, and he was the one son of many children who had lived and grown to be a man, out of all those small ones that Marcus and Faustina had buried across the long years. And perhaps that is part of why the father held on to him so, and hoped so hard, and could not quite bring himself to see clearly what others may already have suspected, that this boy, strong and handsome and quick, had not been given the same quiet, serious, dutiful soul that his father had spent a whole life shaping in himself, and Marcus did everything a careful father could do. He gave the boy the best teachers. He took him along to the frontier to learn the weight of rule at his side. He raised him up beside himself as partner in the empire while he still lived, so that the passing of power would be smooth and settled. And in all of this you can feel the love of a father who wanted, more than he wanted anything for himself, to leave the world in good hands, to hand the lamp on to someone who would keep it burning, and history, which is not always kind, would go on to disappoint that hope. For Commodus, when his own turn came, would not carry the weight the way his father had carried it, would let much of the careful work slip and turn instead to his own pleasures and his own vanities, so that later men would look back and call it the place where the long golden afternoon of the empire finally began to tilt toward evening. But let us not lay all of that at the old man's feet tonight, and let us certainly not lay it there in any hard or scolding voice, because the truth we can hold gently is simply this, that here was a man who could master almost everything. His own anger, his own grief, his own fear of death, the vast machinery of an empire, the long agony of the wars, everything except the one thing no parent can ever truly master, which is what grows in the heart of a child. And if he hoped too hard and saw too little, well, that is the oldest and most forgivable blindness there is, the blindness of a loving father who wants to believe the best of his own boy. And perhaps that too, in its way, is part of the truest measure of him, that even the wisest man of his age was, at the last, just a father who loved his son and hoped and was wrong, and we can hold that with tenderness rather than judgment, because most of us, if we are honest, understand exactly how he came to hope the way he did, and so we come, softly now, and without any hurry, to thee. Very end of the long life, to the spring of the year 180, 1600 years ago and more, when the old emperor lay ill in a camp on the northern frontier, near the great river he had guarded for so long, in the cold lands far from the marble and the fountains of the Rome he had been born in, and had seen so little of in all his years of ruling it, and the illness. Whatever it was, a fever, a sickness of the body worn down past mending, perhaps the very plague that had haunted his whole reign coming at last for him too, took him slowly and did not let him go, and he understood, being the kind of man he was, exactly what was happening. And he met it the way he had spent 40 years teaching himself to meet it, without struggle and without complaint, because he had written to himself so many times that death was nothing to be afraid of, that it was only nature doing with him what nature does with all its creatures, folding him back into the great turning hole from which he had briefly been lifted. The way a wave lifts for a moment out of the sea, and then sinks back and is the sea again, and having told himself that so often, in the long nights by the lamp he found, we may hope, that he believed it now when it mattered, and around him in those last days gathered the people of his household and his court and his physicians, and, near at hand, that son whom he had raised to follow him. And there is a story told about how he spent his final strength, and we will tell it the way we tell all such stories on these quiet nights, gently, and with the small honest reminder that it may have been polished a little in the passing down, that it may be as much what men wished he had said as what he truly said, but that it is far too fitting to leave out. And the story goes that as those around him began to weep, as people do at a great man's dying, he asked them, in effect, why they wept for him, an old man who had lived his life and was only doing now what every living thing must do, and told them instead to weep rather for the plague and for the many, many dead that the long sickness had carried away in his years, the countless ordinary souls, the mothers and the children and the soldiers and the strangers, whose deaths were the real sorrow, not his own quiet passing at the natural end of a full life. And there is another gentle image handed down, that near the end he turned their grief away from himself and toward the sun that was going down, as if to say, do not look here, at one tired old man leaving as men have always left, but look there, at the great light setting as it sets every evening, and will rise again tomorrow, whether I am here to see it or not. And whether he said these things exactly so, or whether they grew a little in the loving telling of them, they are too much like the man he truly was to set aside, because that was his lesson, wasn't it, all his life long? To turn the eye away from the small self and its small troubles, and out toward the vast calm turning of the whole, the sun and the stars and the seasons and the sea, in which one man's ending is a very small and very soft thing, no more to be feared than the closing of a flower at dusk. And so, in that spring, on the frontier, the last of Rome's good emperors closed his eyes and let the great sea take back its wave, and was gone at 58 years old, worn out in the service of a duty he never wanted and never once put down, and the lamp in the tent, we may imagine, burned on a little while after in the sudden quiet, the way a lamp does, indifferent and faithful, casting its small warm light over the plain table and the folded pages and the empty chair, before someone gently leaned in and blew it out. And here, tonight, is where the channel always does the thing it does, where we lift our eyes, as he taught, away from the small sad fact of one good man's death, and out toward what endures. And it is a strange and quiet and rather beautiful thing that endures, because you might think that what would last of such a man would be the empire he guarded, and yet the empire passed, as all empires pass, slowly at first and then all at once, until the marble cracked and the fountains ran dry, and the very city he was born in became a place of ruins and grazing sheep. And you might think that what would last would be the wars he fought so long and so hard on the cold river, and yet the wars are forgotten now by all but a few patient. Scholars, the names of the tribes and the battles gone soft and dim as smoke, and even the great bronze horseman, the calm statue on the hill that we spoke of at the very beginning, even that survived more by luck than by anything, spared the melting down that took nearly every other bronze emperor, only because later ages mistook him for someone else, and so let him stand. And none of these, not the empire, nor the wars, nor even the horse of bronze, is really the thing that keeps him alive tonight in this room with you. because the thing that endures, the thing that truly outlasted all of it, is the smallest and least likely thing of all. It is the little book, the private notebook, the pages he wrote to no one, by lamplight, in a language not even his own everyday tongue. Never titled, never polished for other eyes, never meant to be read by a single living soul but himself, just an old, tired, decent man talking gently to his own weary heart in the dark, reminding himself to be patient, to be kind, to do the next plain duty and not to complain, to remember how small and brief all his troubles were against the turning of the stars, to meet the difficult people of the coming day without bitterness, to accept what he could not change and to change what he could, and to know, with a quiet, unshowy wisdom, the difference. And that little book, by the sheerest accident, by some copy made, and then another down the long dark centuries, when so very much else was lost, survived, drifted down the 1600 years and more between his lamp and yours, and washed up at last, still legible, still warm, still speaking, in the hands of strangers he could never have imagined, in lands he never knew existed, and it is being read still, tonight, in 100 languages, by people who are frightened or grieving or simply tired, who open it and find, to their surprise, a friend, an old friend who understands exactly how heavy an ordinary day can be, and who says to them, softly, across all that time, you can bear this, and it will pass, and you are a small part of something very large and very calm. So let your troubles be small too, and rest, and that, in the end, is the truest measure of the man, not the throne he sat on, but the kindness he wrote down, not the wars he won or lost, but the gentleness he practised on himself in private, when no one was watching, and no one would ever. He thought, no, a good, tired, decent man, who wanted with his whole heart the quiet life of study and books and friendship, and was handed instead the hardest life the world had to give, and carried it anyway, without bitterness, to the very end, and left behind, all unknowing, only this, only his own kindness to himself, written by one small flame in a cold tent, as a gift he never meant to give to a world he would never see. And if that is not a kind of quiet immortality, the gentlest and least vain immortality a man could have, then there is no such thing. And so, having walked the whole long life through twice now, first quickly and then slowly, from that first breath in the golden Rome of the year 121 to that last breath on the cold frontier in the year 180, we can let him go, gently, and let him rest, because he has earned his rest 100 times over, and now, softly, we come back from ancient Rome and the frozen river and the little flame in the tent, back across all those centuries, back into this room, your room, where the lamp is still lit and still warm, keeping its small faithful watch just as his did, and where there is still nowhere at all you need to be, and nothing you need to do, because the day is done and the story is told, and you have listened well, and now the only thing left is the sweetest thing, which is to sleep. So let your shoulders drop the last little way, and let your breathing slow, and let the warmth settle over you like a soft cloak drawn up to the chin, and know that the same stars that turned over Rome when Marcus was a boy sleeping on the bare ground, and turned over the cold camp when he wrote his last quiet page by the last small flame, those very same stars are turning tonight over the hills outside your window, unhurried and calm and endlessly patient, the same stars, the same sky, holding you as they held him and everyone who has ever laid down tired at the end of a long day. And there is such comfort in that, in how small and soft it makes all our troubles, yours and mine and his, against that great slow turning, and so let the last of the day's thoughts loosen and drift away like smoke from a snuffed candle, one by one, until there is nothing left to hold and nothing left to carry, and you are sinking, gently, easily, without any effort at all, down into the deep kind country of sleep, where it is warm and quiet and safe, and where the lamp will keep burning for you a little while longer, its small warm watch over the room over you, before it too, in its own good time, goes softly and gently out. So sleep now. There is nothing more to do tonight. Sleep now and rest, because he is still here in the lamplight, and so are we, and we will still be here whenever you need us. Tomorrow, or the night after, or any tired night at all, the lamp lit, the room warm, the old friend and his little book close at hand, and the same calm stars turning slowly overhead, so let go now, all the way, and drift, and sleep. Good night. Rest well.